so many of you have been asking for this video. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to fire these pots and show you the results. Fundamentally, I'm a potter first and YouTuber second, which means sometimes there are delays in between making something and firing it. But in this week's video I can finally show you the results from these material tests. But we'll do a quick recap for those of you who are new to the channel or haven't seen part 1 of this video. If you want to go straight to the action, skip to about 6.5 minutes. I've been mixing metal into my clay for a few years now, be it silver, bronze, hammer scale, ilmenite, and even rust scraped off metalwork in the courtyard where my workshop is. The results, like you can see on screen now, are always quite interesting. Sometimes they're very surprising too, such as these beautiful red dots I get from bronze and the copper therein that react and blossom during the reduction firing. Other materials aren't nearly as interesting, such as this sterling silver, for instance, which has just created these discoloured blotches across the piece. You win some, you lose some, and that's part of what makes this experimentation interesting. Anyhow, recently I was sent this parcel by a potter and toolmaker who goes by the handle Sophisticated Pagan. I'll leave a link to his website in the description below, as his tools are really worth checking out. He sent me numerous things like tungsten, crushed malachite, tourmaline, both fine and coarse, and even tiny sharp shards of obsidian, all of which I'll mix into the standard stoneware clay body I use. I'll mark each of the pieces I make with a small dot on the foot ring. This way I can identify them. Sometimes I know roughly what a material might do, but in this instance I haven't worked with any of these before. I know malachite contains copper, which when reduction fired turns red. As for the others, I really have no clue. I think small bowls make good test vessels, so I'm going to weigh out 5 half-pound lumps of clay, about 226 grams. I'll give these a quick wedge, and then I'm going to press them out on the workbench. This way I can sprinkle the raw materials across them and then roll them up. Then each lump will be wedged up again. Perhaps the trickiest part of all of this is how some of these very coarse, sharp materials will influence the throwing and trimming. By the way, this clay by itself doesn't have much of an influence on the glaze above it. Small black dots do appear. These are tiny chunks of iron that bubble out during the reduction firing process, but I imagine all of these additions will stand out quite starkly against those. I'll start with the malachite, which is this beautiful turquoise colour. I should mention that since making the last video, this stuff can be rather toxic when exposed to water, so please don't replicate this test. I should have done my due diligence beforehand, but it's all a bit too late now. I then roll the slab up, and then I'll give the clay a good wedge to properly distribute all the fine particles of malachite. And I'll score an M onto the lump, this way I'll know which ones I'm working with when throwing them. Next is the tungsten, and you won't believe how this stuff reacts. I was utterly surprised by how it fired, so hold on to your hats. What I didn't realise is the sheer difference between tungsten and tungsten carbide, the stuff many of my trimming tools are made from. Thus, I thought this stuff would remain relatively inert and would perhaps create silvery or black dots on the piece that barely melted. Anyway, that's enough foreshadowing. Next is the powdered tourmaline. This stuff is really fine, so my thoughts were in this concentration it probably wouldn't do much when fully incorporated. Tourmaline contains a whole bunch of different things including iron, which I think in this case will probably have the biggest influence on how it finally fires. So it could just darken the clay, but honestly I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. Next is the more coarsely ground tourmaline. This will definitely do something, but again with all the iron this contains, I think the results will be relatively predictable, creating thousands of little metallic dots across the surface. But it can also contain boron, aluminium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and lithium, so depending on the ratios, who knows how this stuff will end up firing. And lastly, we've got the obsidian. I'm really curious to see how this will fire. I imagine it's going to become very fluid and melt rather a lot with the glaze. I'm also quite nervous about throwing this stuff, considering how sharp obsidian can be. But it's always surprising how cushioned sharp materials become when completely mixed and surrounded by soft, malleable clay. I imagine I'll get a small scratch or two, but please again don't try this one at home. So, in this video I'm going to skip over the throwing and trimming of these pots, as that's something I discussed in much more detail in the previous video I made about these materials. But if you'd like to see if my hands survived the process, and if the pots were torn apart, I'll leave a link to that video on screen now and in the description below. The last thing I should mention is I know that some of you are really excited about this. This is what I call my Frankenstein clay. It's the waste material from all of these experiments which I've mixed together. It contains copper, manganese, iron, nickel, together with porcelain and a huge range of different stoneware clay types. The idea was that I'd dry some of this stuff out and I'd throw a pot with it to see what it looks like. But after this, I added all of the materials I've just shown you into this mix. And one of them in particular will make using this in the future practically impossible, without the pots pretty much just self-destructing. So I might have to approach that in a slightly different way, or simply sieve out all the larger particles. That could solve it. But it also removes a lot of the fun. You'll see what I mean shortly, and you'll have to let me know how you think I should continue. Anyhow, during the trimming on the bottoms of the feet, I impressed a series of dots next to my maker's mark, so once fired I could tell which pot is which. Provided these don't get obliterated by glaze or the raw materials themselves, it should be relatively easy to tell which pot is which. But I think even if that were to happen, with a bit of deduction, I could probably tell them apart quite easily. So, with all the pots trimmed, and some of them being quite a challenge, the next step is to slowly let these pieces turn bone dry. I'm always a bit cautious about the clay shrinking around the larger particles of metal, as the clay walls as they contract could crack around them. But surprisingly so far, in fact with all the tests I've done, this has never happened, which I think is simply due to the particle size being quite small. There are, by the way, a few other ways of trying this. You could simply insert the bits of metal into the finished trimmed pot. This way you don't have to struggle throwing and trimming them. Or you could simply sprinkle them over the glaze when it's still slightly damp. But what I really like about mixing them into the clay is that you get a range of effects. Some melt on the surface and create very dramatic marks, whereas others are clouded over, partly hidden by the glaze. It feels more natural in a way, to me at least. And I suppose ultimately, if I want to incorporate any of these into my work, I want them to look natural as opposed to just dusted over the surface. The pots are now bone dry, so I'm packing them into my electric kiln for a biscuit firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. With those I'm a bit apprehensive about, I'll place them on an additional piece of kiln shelf. This way if something does melt, it shouldn't damage too much. The material I'm most concerned about is the obsidian, as it has a very low melting point, but I think everything else should survive the firing pretty well. During this first firing, the stoneware can touch, as it won't get hot enough to melt and stick to each other. This process also changes clay into ceramic, the clay body hardening and becoming partly vitrified and porous. This means the clay can no longer be recycled and is somewhat permanent. Now, for the obsidian bowl, as this is the piece I'm most worried about, I'm going to raise it up on these small waddings, which I make from 50% china clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. This way, if the obsidian does melt and move, it shouldn't stick the pot onto the kiln shelf or cause damage to anything. By the way, I've actually made 10 bowls in total, so that I've got 2 of each. I've also made a few other larger pots with these inclusions, which, if they fire successfully, you'll see posted over on my Instagram account. With the kiln now fully packed, it can be closed up, the program set and fired overnight. These electric kilns are essentially gigantic toasters, with very powerful elements and a lid, trapping all the hot air that's created inside. Unlike my gas kiln, which I'll fire later, this kiln is completely automatic, and I can keep track of how it's going via an app on my phone. It's now about 2 days later, and the kiln has cooled down enough to unpack. It all looked great initially. The obsidian had barely started to melt, and all it started to do was bubble and create these sharp little points on the surface. Which is great news, as if this stuff ends up being a successful addition, I don't need to worry about propping the pots up when firing them. I then removed the next kiln shelf, and I was met with disaster. This is the tungsten, the material I thought would practically do nothing. Yet, instead, the pots with this stuff mixed in have practically exploded. They're like growths, almost, on the surface, and the metal has become powdery and soft and green. When posting the results of these on Instagram, somebody called Will gave the following explanation. Essentially, tungsten oxidizes at around 1000 degrees Celsius. It turns into tungsten oxide and undergoes significant volume expansion, and it becomes very brittle and turns a yellowish colour. Interestingly, what I could do now is harvest as much of the yellow-green oxide as possible, crush it into a fine powder, and then add it as a colourant into a glaze. If that's something you folks would like to see, let me know, and I'll add it to my to-do list. It's rather spectacular though, isn't it? Will Chase also said that it likely also turned from a solid to a gas, which explains the bubbled surface much of the tungsten has. Beyond pots blowing up because they're too damp, I don't think I've ever seen destruction quite like this. It's rather beautiful, in fact, despite looking a bit like growths or some fungus that are pistachio coloured. There were lots of comments suggesting I try to save the pot and preserve it in this state. But it's so brittle and fragile that I think displaying it in any meaningful way would be practically impossible. I did though find a medium bowl with some tungsten contamination towards the rim. It was only mildly damaged, so I'll try glazing this and firing it, and most likely I'll post the results of this on my Instagram too, in the next few weeks. So, at this point we've got 4 surviving bowls, and I'm simply going to glaze each of them in this pale green felspathic crackle glaze. I dip this on rather thickly and swirl around the excess that gathers on the inside into a thicker layer. Their feet have been waxed, by the way. This creates an area the glaze won't be able to adhere to, as the water all the raw materials are mixed into can't be absorbed into the body here, and therefore a layer of those raw materials can't stick to it, which is what will happen everywhere else. I keep the pot shaking for a moment, as this helps the glaze on the foot to drip off, and it also helps it to settle into a neater layer on the rest of the shape. For this step at least, the mixed in additions don't make any difference. The water is simply pulled into the porous body, and the raw materials particles, which are larger, simply adhere as a layer on the outside. The longer the pots are dipped for, the thicker this layer, but if you keep them submerged for too long, the pots can become oversaturated with water, meaning the glaze takes an awfully long time to dry, and it'll either just crack off at this stage, or there's a chance it'll crawl during the second firing, which is when the glaze begins to separate from itself. The next step the following day is to tidy up the glazed surface. This, by the way, glazing and tidying up the shapes thereafter, is a subject I just covered in much greater detail, and I'll leave a link to that video on screen now and in the description below. Simply put, I fettle the surface so it's flatter, I get rid of the tongue marks or any other raised patches of glaze, and I also sponge clean the foot, so there's absolutely no glaze on the bottom, as otherwise they might stick to the kiln shelves. As I do this, I work over a basin of water, as this will collect much of the dust that comes off the piece. It also means that eventually I can recycle this glaze back into the larger container of glaze these pots were initially dipped into. And with that, these pots can be placed into the gas kiln. I've placed the obsidian bowl and the one with malachite mixed in on these wadding wafers, again just to protect the kiln shelf underneath them. During this firing the pots cannot touch, otherwise the powdery layer of glaze that coats them will stick and fuse together. Early the following morning, the reduction firing can begin. This takes about 8.5 hours from beginning to end, and unlike the electric kiln which is fired automatically, this is a completely manual process. The kiln is lit with the door open. This way gas doesn't accumulate in the chamber, which is all then suddenly ignited. And initially the gas pressure is kept really low. This way the temperature rises slowly initially. If you fire pots too quickly, they will explode, as even at this point they can contain moisture, and if that all suddenly turns to steam, the pots will quite literally explode. So at the beginning it's taken slowly, and then at 860 degrees precisely, I initiate the reduction atmosphere by sliding the damper to be half closed and increase the gas pressure and air pressure. This causes too much fuel to accumulate in the chamber, with there not being sufficient oxygen present for it to burn efficiently. This means the atmosphere ends up stripping oxygen away from the clay and glazes themselves, thus creating colours and textures that you can't quite easily replicate with an electric kiln. And please bear that in mind, as if you try any of these additions in your clay and you glaze fire them in an oxidised atmosphere, you will not get the same results as I get. I fired the kiln to cone 10 and it's now about 2 days later, which means I can finally unpack it and see the results. Starting off with the slightly more coarse tourmaline, which did sort of what I expected. It's created a highly flecked, dotted surface, as the iron contained has turned into these little molten pools of metal. Next up is the very fine tourmaline, which by all accounts has done practically nothing. The pot appears to be slightly more speckled, but it's not very noticeable. The third vessel is the malachite encrusted piece, and I think the copper contained has pretty much dominated the surface, turning into this red tone in practically the same way the bronze inclusions I've been adding have. With that being said, I like how it seems to have covered the entire surface here, and how there are areas where it sort of fades in between red and green. It's a sort of plum-like colour, and I really like it. And lastly, the bowl embedded with obsidian. The results aren't quite as dramatic as I anticipated, but there are a few more noticeable black molten dots. But I honestly expected them to be a bit more fluid, and perhaps I have to try this one again with a glaze that is itself more fluid. Before I show you these in much greater detail, both as standalone pieces and with some macro shots, the next thing I have to do is sand the bottoms clean on each of these. The obsidian piece especially had some sharper shards of glass on the base. Equally the stoneware, which only contains 10% grog, despite being burnished to a glassy smoothness at the leather hard stage, becomes quite rough and coarse again as the stoneware shrinks around the pre-fired particles of ceramic the body contains. There are some subtle differences between all the pieces though, especially the bowl with malachite in, one being completely covered in the crimson colour, whilst the other is sort of half and half. Here are some close-ups of the red. The thing I really like is how the particles of malachite haven't created individual blots, but rather just a red blushing on the piece. This is a chunk of bronze, I think, by the way. I'm not entirely sure why certain parts of the vessel aren't so red, as the particles would have been mixed evenly throughout it, but I like this variation and the surface interest it creates. I've been thinking about doing some copper red pots soon, more conventionally without the use of malachite, but perhaps irritatingly what's so nice about this is that it straddles both my old set of glazes and sort of merges it with a copper red, creating a surface that I haven't really seen before. Why did the malachite have to be the toxic one? Next are the coarse particles of tourmaline. In a way I don't mind these, but I think they're too speckled and too brown for me. The surface is indeed interesting, and perhaps with a darker glaze it could make a nice addition, as it wouldn't be quite so overpowering. I like what it does to the clay body though, as it creates these darker black dots that cover it, but I don't think this will be an addition that I use regularly, unless I'm really craving some polka dots. Next up is the much finer tourmaline. This really hasn't done very much at all other than create a very fine layer of black dots that cover the clay body and the glaze, but it's hard to differentiate them from the iron that's already present in the clay body. With a macro lens and extension tubes you can sort of see them, and on the clay body itself. But otherwise the effect was rather insignificant, and I may as well just use iron to achieve the same result. And lastly, there's the obsidian. This is on the verge of being interesting, I think. Perhaps larger chunks could have worked better, or if they were sprinkled directly on the surface of the glaze. I like the pockmarks they've made in the clay body, and the very subtle movement you can see just underneath the glass, but otherwise it looks just like iron in many cases. I think it would have worked better had I glazed the piece with a glaze that was much more fluid itself, so I'll try that in the future. For the time being though, out of all of these, I think the malachite was easily my favourite. There are plum tones to it, but also a much more intense red towards the rim, and it's a warmer tone which perhaps my palette of colours needs. Anyway, you'll have to let me know which one you like best, and if you have any good ideas of materials I should test out in future experiments and videos, I'd love to hear your ideas too. For now though, thank you so much for taking your time to watch, and for your patience for waiting for me to fire these pieces. And, as always, I'll see you next time.